Hi, I'm Stephanie Jones. I'm a professor in the neuroscience department here at Brown University.
And hi, I'm Chloe Zimmerman. I'm an MD Ph.D. candidate in the neuroscience department in Stephanie Jones and Frederica Petschner's labs.
And this is Faces of Brown Research.
So qigong is a practice that originated and evolved in ancient China. And it has been utilized throughout time in China for many different reasons. In the modern scientific literature, it's come to be referred to in a category of practices called meditative movement. And that's because a fundamental component of it is using these gentle rhythmic movements alongside the cultivation of a meditative awareness in order to facilitate a sense of health and well-being. The meaning of the term qigong, the translation of qi is as life force or vital energy, and gong is often translated as gathering or movement. So it's literally meant to mean like the gathering and movement of life force through the body using the intention of the mind. There's many ways of practicing qigong, and there's some more spiritual forms of it that have evolved more from the Taoist tradition, and there's more medical forms of it that have evolved more from the traditional Chinese medicine perspective. And that's really important because that heavily affects how and why you practice it. And so we were really interested in the medical forms of it. And those are really steeped in the history of Chinese medicine and the theory of health within Chinese medicine, which states that health is always this sense of dynamic balance of the flow of vital energies in the body. And when you experience disease, it's because there's some form of imbalance or stagnance in the way that energy is flowing. And so the movements of qigong are selected to release those patterns of tension and allow for a more cohesive flow of energy in the body. And it is really important to keep in mind that there's many, many forms of qigong, and many different practitioners will select different practices for different things. In this study, we were really interested in how to improve fatigue in cancer survivors. And so the qigong expert who was putting together the course selected practices that were specifically focused on this sense of nourishing life.
Yeah, and in the scientific realm, there's a lot of people now interested in understanding what are the physiological mechanisms of qigong, of this idea of moving energy from your body that creates a connection between your brain and your body that ultimately leads to healing and to improve vitality and health. And so we've been studying how can we measure the impact of qigong on behavioral outcomes like fatigue, but also on things that we can measure in the body, like changes in the blood with the brain. And so that's, from a scientific point of view, what we're trying to understand is how is this healing manifested within the body and the brain.
So a really interesting aspect of the study was the dialogue that had to happen between the qigong experts and the scientists in the design of the study. A lot of times how qigong is practiced, the expert teacher looks for particular signs of improvement within the qigong tradition and then adapts their advice accordingly. And in a scientific study, you want something replicable that's delivered the same way to every person. And so we had a really interesting back and forth about how do you balance that in the context of a research study that you're trying to publish and put out to the medical community while making sure you're getting like the best possible effects and teachings within the qigong course. So I was at Brown as an undergrad. I was a Ph.D. student, so I knew I would be attending medical school here. And before I started at Brown, my mom had actually been diagnosed with brain cancer. And so through her care, I'd seen how the medical system was really good at treating the biology of the illness, but there were a lot of components of her experience that were not addressed, and those were sort of the important things for her overall sense of suffering. And so I'd gotten really interested in how different medical traditions approach more of this holistic sense of whole person care. And Cathy actually had arrived at Brown and was teaching in the Contemplative Studies Initiative. And she had this really unique background where she was trained as a neuroscientist, but she had studied mind-body medicine and medical humanities originally. And she was starting studies looking at the impacts of meditation and qigong on the brain. And so she became my undergraduate advisor. And as I was finishing undergraduate, she received a really generous donation from a alumni donor who was interested in how we can better understand the effects of vital energy practices in medicine. And Cathy was a really unique person for leading that study because she had been experiencing cancer herself for the past 20-some years. And she had been utilizing qigong alongside conventional cancer treatments to really maintain her overall sense of health. Like, she constantly surprised oncologists with how vibrant and dynamic she was, despite the very intense treatments she was receiving. My role within that study became, I delayed medical school, and I became her lab manager and project coordinator and helped with the initial conceptualizations of the study and the putting together of the randomized control trial and recruiting the participants. I actually did all the classes with the participants and then have worked on the analysis. And Cathy unfortunately passed away in 2016, right around the end of the first year of the study. And so then Stephanie had been her advisor in her neuroscience retraining. And Stephanie actually took over the study, and I stayed on to help facilitate the end of it.
So Chloe's being modest. She was actually quite a lead in this scientific research. And as she said, it all started with Cathy. And Cathy and I were actually collaborators over 20 years ago at Mass General Hospital in Boston. And I was studying mechanisms of somatosensations, the sense of touch in the body. And we were doing studies about attention. What happens in the brain when you pay attention to different parts of the body? And Cathy at that time was also studying mindfulness-based stress reduction meditation, which is about paying attention to your body. And so we became collaborators where I was already studying mechanisms of attention using a technique called MEG and EEG, which measures signals from outside of the brain of underlying brain activity. And it was a natural collaboration for her to try to understand, well, how does mindfulness meditation change this attentional modulation in the body and the brain? And so we started collaborating on those studies where I was really leading the data collection, the data analysis, the signals that we were interested in with attention, and she was leading the mindfulness parts of this and recruiting the subjects and relating it to mind-body practices. But then when she ultimately passed in 2016, she asked me to take over stewardship of the project and of the students. And so I was fortunate to inherit her students into my group, and it's just been a phenomenal experience.
A big part of the study was trying to look at when you explicitly take a practice like qigong, where at its very core, it's talking about energy movement in the body and experiencing a sense of energy. What clinical measures change as a result of taking that seriously? And what basic science measures that we don't currently account for could be measured to advance our understanding of how to cultivate vital energy within a day-to-day medical experience. So that was a big impetus behind the broader goals of the study.
Yeah, it is quite remarkable that these, very gentle, slow movements that people that have chronic fatigue can incorporate into their life regularly has as equal an effect as, at least in our small sample that we studied, had an equal effect as Pilates exercise and plant-based nutrition, both of which are known to be promote health and vital energy. The whole idea that Cathy wanted to understand was, what is the relationship between the brain and the body? And one way that you can measure that is by measuring the electrical signals of the brain non-invasively with this technique called EEG, and measuring the electrical signals of the muscle with a technique called EMG. And so we have EEG and EMG recordings from these patients that we're still analyzing and seeing some interesting initial findings and hoping that that will turn into publication quality material.
An additional component that came out of that study was that access to these practices can be really difficult. And there's so much interest among cancer patients and survivors to find them, but it's not necessarily in the mainstream. And so in Frederica Peschner's lab, we've been developing this app to treat chronic pain, where we're looking at putting mind-body interventions on the app. And a big goal has been expanding that into cancer-related pain and fatigue, and including practices like qigong and meditation, where you can run larger scale, more remote studies to develop large data sets on how this impacts people as they go through an illness journey. And a big thing we focused on in the last year was we actually completed very detailed exit interviews with all the participants in both the qigong and the exercise nutrition group. And we've been analyzing those qualitative interviews. And what's been really interesting is we had this main statistical finding that fatigue was decreased by roughly the same amount in both groups. And so in one sense, it looks like they might be equivalent in their amount of fatigue reduction. But what we're finding in the interviews is there's a lot more nuance to how that fatigue change occurred in the way people experience the class. So for instance, people in the exercise group are saying things like, I learned to push through my fatigue, and that really helped me stick with the exercise, and I learned to not listen to it as much. Whereas in the qigong group, they're saying I learned to honor my fatigue and let my body rest and restore. And so I think some really interesting follow-up studies are looking at, are there different mechanisms by which you're getting this similar amount of fatigue reduction across groups? And will that help us identify who might do best in what intervention?
An interesting thing along the way is that soon after I inherited the project, my mom got diagnosed with small cell lung cancer. And we immediately brought in qigong practice into her healthcare journey. She also did traditional treatments, chemo, radiation. My mom's cancer-free 5 years later, which was remarkable because it was a very dire prognosis at the beginning. And so it's been a really interesting journey working in this field of qigong and bringing my scientific expertise to try to study what are the mechanisms of what's going on, and working collaboratively with Chloe because she is the real qigong expert, and trying to bring this into scientific understanding and into clinical practice in a meaningful way.
And a really big component of the study was, it was, I think, Cathy's brainchild and baby. And in order to honor that in her role at Brown, the Contemplative Studies Initiative started a lecture series in her name called the Cathy Kerr Vital Energy
Research
Collaborative. Yeah, the Cathy Kerr Vital Energy Research Collaborative that's been hosting different lectures with outside speakers from both the Chinese medical tradition and modern scientists, modern clinicians, and hosting a dialogue between the three to actually think through how do we move forward this sort of research and how do we take seriously vital energy within medicine.
One of the primary end points of our study was to create scientific evidence that this is actually helping with fatigue, and there are measurable signals within the brain and the body. So we're still ongoing work that we're continuing. But as Chloe said, it's morphed now into a new study looking at brain-body mechanisms through the relationship between the heart and the brain, and then looking at how do we give these interventions more broadly, potentially through the app that Frederica and Chloe have been developing. So the study, it hasn't ended per se, but the end game was, let's create awareness, let's create scientific evidence, let's understand how this is, bring it to more people and more conditions, and continue to get some fundamental understanding of how to do that properly. Yeah, and I guess the only thing to add is how grateful we are to the patients that participated. Getting involved in a study 3 times a week, and they were really motivated because of their fatigue symptoms. But it doesn't move forward without those kind of volunteers, and so that's really fortunate. Yes, a good group of people involved.
And same with everyone who worked on the study. There was this group of extremely dedicated undergrads, where none of it would have been possible without that amount of work.
Yeah, when Cathy passed, we were just kind of all left with the pieces of how to continue this on, and everybody just really dove right in. The students that were involved, people in my lab, her colleagues and friends, and people in the contemplative studies group and in the neuroscience group here at Brown, everybody really came together to continue what Cathy had started, which has been perhaps the best thing that's happened.